Good morning. I'm Michael Cooper, Member of Parliament for St. Albert, Edmonton, and a member of the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleagues on the committee, Conservative colleagues, MP Michael Barrett, who is co-vice chair, and MP Dominique Vien. We're here to discuss our interim dissenting report on the question of expanding MAiD where a mental disorder is the sole underlying condition. Although the main interim report primarily restates and summarizes evidence that the committee heard, it departs in one significant and problematic way, and that is that it calls on the Government of Canada to implement the recommendations of the expert panel on MAiD and mental illness, a panel that was tasked with coming up with recommendations on the implementation of MAiD in the context of mental illness. In so calling on the government to implement those recommendations, what the committee has done in its main interim report has endorsed the Liberal government's radical expansion of MAiD in cases of sole mental illness. This is problematic in at least two respects. First of all, the mandate of the committee is to broadly study the issue of MAiD and mental illness. Part of that review makes it necessary to consider and weigh the appropriateness of such an expansion. An expansion that, by the way, was put forward at the 11th hour when the Liberals and Justice Minister David Lametti accepted a Senate amendment to Bill C-7 last year and then shut down debate in the House of Commons after only one day without consultation and study. And so it is necessary that the committee give full consideration of the issue rather than just endorsing the government's rushed expansion of MAiD in this regard. A second issue of concern and why it's problematic is based upon the evidence that we heard. Expert evidence that raises serious doubt about the expansion of MAiD to include sole mental illness, serious doubt about whether this can be done safely at this time. And MP Barrett will go into some detail about some of the expert evidence that we heard. But one of the key issues that we heard from experts is the question of predicting irremediability in the context of mental illness. Under the law, in order to qualify for MAiD, one must suffer from a grievous and irremediable condition. Under the law, a grievous and irremediable condition is defined as an incurable condition in which one is in an irreversible state of decline. In other words, what a MAiD assessor must determine from the standpoint of determining whether a patient is eligible is to determine that that patient's condition will not improve, that they will not get better. What we heard from expert witness after expert witness is that it is not possible, or at the very least very difficult, to predict whether someone suffering from a mental health condition can get better, can improve, that there is no objective criteria, that such assessments are reduced to guesswork. Even the expert panel conceded the difficulty in predicting whether someone suffering from a mental health issue can get better when the expert panel said in its report, in the case of mental illness, quote, "It is difficult, if not impossible, for clinicians to make accurate predictions about the future for an individual patient, end of quote. If one cannot predict whether someone suffering from a mental health issue can get better, then there stands the significant risk that persons who suffer from mental health will prematurely end their life. Persons who might have years, if not decades, to live a healthy and fulfilling life. In the face of that evidence, in the face of that uncertainty, it is completely unacceptable and it is dangerous to rush such an expansion of MAiD for persons who are suffering solely from an underlying mental health condition. And yet, that is precisely the untenable position that David Lametti and the Liberals have put vulnerable Canadians in when they recklessly and irresponsibly accepted that Senate amendment last year without meaningful study, without meaningful consultation, and now with a wide body of evidence that we heard from experts who question the appropriateness and question whether such an expansion can be implemented safely, having regard for the significant risks involved. And so I say to the government, to the Liberals, to Minister Lametti, that if you have regard for vulnerable Canadians and care about the risks involved, then the responsible course to take to ensure that vulnerable persons do not fall through the cracks is to put a legislative pause on this expansion until these uncertainties can be better understood. And the minister can do that, the government can do that by extending the sunset clause past March of 2023. Let me say before turning it over to MP Barrett that when we're talking about persons who are suffering from mental illness, we're talking about some of the most vulnerable persons in Canadian society in the context of a procedure that is irreversible. Once it's carried out, it's carried out. There is no coming back. The person is dead. It underscores why we need to proceed cautiously and why we need to get this right. And with that, I will turn it over to MP Barrett.
Well, thanks very much, MP Cooper, and good morning. Thanks for joining us. This is an incredibly important topic, and I want to start by underscoring the primary challenge that we're faced with as parliamentarians in this context is the rush nature that has been set in motion by the government in commissioning the work of this joint committee, giving only a few months in the spring to undertake the work. You contrast that against what took place in the National Assembly of Quebec, and you'll quickly see the seriousness with which a legislative body can take with a matter such as this, with this particular matter, or when there is a predestined outcome in mind for the government, they'll disregard the feedback of experts, they'll disregard the feedback of Canadians. And it's important that Mr. Cooper mentioned that the government ignored concerns. And when you talk about the consultations of Canadians when they were invited to provide feedback on MAiD by the Department of Justice, the Justice Department's report on the results concluded, and I'll quote, "A majority of those who provided comments were not in favor of extending MAiD to people who suffer from mental illness," close quote. Now, with respect to evidence about the accuracy of predictions of irremediability, I want to offer a few pieces of evidence that we heard at the committee. For example, Dr. John Maher, a clinical psychiatrist and medical ethicist, said, quote, "Psychiatrists don't know and can't know who will get better and live decades of good life. Brain diseases are not liver diseases," closed quote. A clinical psychiatrist and professor at the University of Quebec said, and this is Dr. Brian Mishara, quote, "I'm a scientist. The latest Cochrane review of research on the ability to find some indicator of the future course of a mental illness, either treated or untreated, concluded that we have no specific scientific ways of doing this. We are relying on the clinical hunch of someone who hasn't known the person for 20 or 30 years and who has no scientific data showing that they can determine this," close quote. Now, Dr. Mishara further noted that, quote, "Even the most severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia, are unpredictable," closed quote. Now, I'll offer one more quote from evidence and then refer to the expert panel's conclusions. Dr. Valerie Masuda, a physician and MAiD assessor, said, quote, "When we look at what irremediable means in mental illness, I think it's very difficult to predict and to say that this person has tried a lot of things, but their depression they cannot recover from," close quote. So the expert panel conceded the difficulty in determining the irremediability of a mental disorder. I'll quote from the expert panel. "The evolution of many mental disorders, like some other chronic conditions, is difficult to predict for a given individual. There is limited knowledge about the long-term prognosis for many conditions, and it is difficult, if not impossible, for clinicians to make accurate predictions about the future for an individual patient," close quote. So make no mistake, if the government continues the rushed and, frankly, reckless expansion of MAiD, people who would have gotten better will be robbed of that chance. Vulnerable Canadians will continue to be victimized. We're now at a point where every single week we are reading stories in the media about Canadians who are being victimized by MAiD. We're hearing heartbreaking stories from families with loved ones who have been, frankly, victimized by the medical assistance in dying regime, and their lives are taken away too soon. These are appalling reports of people who are suffering so much because they didn't have somewhere to live, they didn't have access to health care or counseling services, or not being able to afford to live and turning to medically assisted death. I think we can all agree that this legislation was not created to euthanize people because they're poor. As legislators, we need to be ensuring protection for the most vulnerable among us, and as a society, we should be standing up for the dignity of every single one of our fellow citizens. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, I want to conclude the same way. The deadline imposed on the committee to present its report was this week. An extension was given until October 17th of this year. That's less than 4 months from now, and it's not reasonable. It would be negligent to rush this through when medically assisted death will be expanded as early as spring of 2023. The government must stop the expansion of medically assistance in dying, allow for it to be considered carefully, and to ensure that there are safeguards in place. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, MP Dominique Vien.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Cooper, Monsieur Barrett. Bonjour à chacun et à chacune. Je tiens d'abord à souligner le travail important qui est mené actuellement par le comité mixte. Je pense que nous faisons un travail rigoureux, sérieux sur un sujet qui est extrêmement complexe et qui nous amène à de grandes réflexions aussi. Évidemment, pour ceux et celles qui me connaissent, savez que dans une autre vie, j'ai été membre de l'Assemblée nationale et que donc, lors du débat sur l'aide médicale à mourir, qui s'appelait à ce moment-là les soins de fin de vie, que j'étais présente. Je tiens peut-être à à résumer en une seule phrase, ce que nous essayons de dire ce matin, c'est que la précipitation est bien mauvaise conseillère. Je pense qu'il faut prendre le temps de regarder tous les aspects de cette question de l'aide médicale à mourir, de regarder tous les aspects, tous les angles également qui sont soulevés par rapport au trouble mental qui est donc soulevé dans cette loi. Les collègues ont fait référence à l'Assemblée nationale et c'est très important. L'Assemblée nationale, j'aimerais vous rappeler qu'en 2014, elle a donc fait adopter la loi sur les soins de fin de vie. C'est un processus qui a duré près de 5 ans. Près de 5 ans. Et je me rappelle encore de cet élément-là, je me rappelle de ce moment-là qui a été probablement le moment le plus intense et le plus important de ma vie parlementaire. Et ça m'a pris beaucoup de temps à me faire une idée sur la question. L'Assemblée nationale a déposé à la fin de la session parlementaire en juin le projet de loi 38 qui voit l'élargissement de l'aide médicale à mourir au Québec, qui veut autoriser les demandes anticipées. Et déjà, ils ont, de leur côté, rejeté, pour le moment en tout cas, l'aide médicale à mourir, de l'élargir pour des personnes qui souffrent de maladies mentales. Je pense que le gouvernement de M. Trudeau a procédé à l'envers. Je pense que c'était une très mauvaise idée de mettre dans une pièce législative un élément de temporalité, avant même que nous ayons réfléchi à la question, avant même que nous ayons entendu des experts, avant même que nous ayons fouillé la question, de mettre à l'intérieur d'une loi une date butoir, alors que tout le travail de réflexion et intellectuel n'avait pas été fait. Alors, on procède à l'envers à ce niveau-là. Alors, nous, ce que nous demandons, bien sûr, aujourd'hui, c'est au gouvernement en place de faire preuve de gros bon sens, de se ressaisir et de constater ce que à peu près tout le monde va constater. C'est qu'en 5h30 à peu près que nous avons eu jusqu'à maintenant d'études sur la question, c'est carrément insuffisant. Et on voit ça venir comme une tonne de briques, qu'à l'automne 2022, nous n'aurons pas terminé. Nous n'aurons pas terminé. Alors, dans cet esprit-là, et compte tenu des informations que les collègues vous ont livrées aujourd'hui, on demande instamment, bien sûr, au gouvernement libéral de M. Trudeau de nous donner du temps pour étudier toute cette question. Parce que oui, il y a la question du trouble mental, mais il y a toute la révision aussi qui nous est demandée comme groupe de la loi sur l'aide médicale à mourir qu'on doit revoir à chaque 5 ans. Alors voilà, nous sommes ouverts à vos questions, s'il y en a.
Je ne pense pas que nous avons des questions dans la salle, mais si vous êtes un journaliste qui a une question, levez la main, s'il vous plaît. Alors, on a une question par Zoom de Ryan Tumulty, National Post. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi there. You talked today about extending the sunset clause that is currently in place for mental illness. I'm wondering how long you think an extension would be necessary to properly study this, come up with good solutions.
As much time as needed. There should be no arbitrary timeline imposed. There's lots of work that needs to be done. That was recognized by the 2018 Council of Academies report that spoke about significant knowledge gaps. The Special Select Committee of the National Assembly that my colleague MP Vien referenced, after 74 meetings, determined that there are inherent risks and that such an expansion in Quebec should not take place. And look, we would be the 4th jurisdiction in the world in which one would be able to qualify for MAiD, where mental illness is a sole underlying condition. So having regard for the vulnerabilities of the people involved, having regard for the risks, we need to take as much time as needed to get it right.
And then just following up, is there a way, do you think there is an amount of study that could see your caucus and your party become comfortable with allowing allowing medical assistance in dying for people whose sole diagnosis is a mental illness? Or is there just no way for that?
Well, what is inadequate is to say that such cases are going to be determined on a case-by-case basis, that the criterion in determining whether someone is eligible is entirely subjective, that it is going to be reduced to hunches. That's the evidence that we heard before our committee, and that's completely untenable. It's untenable that the government put vulnerable Canadians in this situation by not undertaking appropriate study to determine the appropriateness of such an expansion. But that's where we're at. It's why we're saying to the government, put a pause on this to do appropriate due diligence. The risks are simply too great to do otherwise.
Okay, so we don't have any more questions either on the Zooms or either in person. So thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.